Hey everybody, nice to see you. I'm joining you today from Charlotte, so East Tennessee. Hello from West Carolinas, just the Blue Ridges between us. Really great to be here and congratulations on your 10th event. That's an indicator of a strong community. And I'm delighted to be here at yet another BSides. I love BSides as an institution, as an organization, our communities, and I'm here to talk to you about detection. So I really appreciated that that was the theme for this year because I love detection, but I come at it from a little bit of a different angle because of all of the time that I've spent in fraud detection and abuse prevention. So a little bit about who I am. If you spent time on the artist formerly known as Twitter, over the last decade, you may have seen me there as Selena Kyle. Profile picture looks like a red vampire. That one's me. I've also spent time at places like Reddit, Bank of America, Google, Electronic Arts, a little bit of time in video games, Tagged, PayPal, Visa, and today I am an independent consultant. My consultancy is called Cartomancy Labs, and I'm kind of vibing in this space between cyber, fraud and abuse, and digital systems. And the reason why I call it digital systems as opposed to consumer-facing platforms, which is how I talk about it sometimes, is because a lot of the organizations I'm working with are going through a digital transformation. And so how their business changes when they go digital, I find very interesting, especially when there are economic or social systems at play, which you can see a few of those names up there known as being economic or social. So how are we going to spend our brief time together today? I tried to organize things like any good whodunit. We're going to have a prelude that kind of provide some clues about where we might wander. I'll provide some context. That's just needless exposition, but I enjoy it. Then we'll have a hook where I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think it's interesting for cyber folk to understand about fraud, things that we can learn from each other, and then there will be a reference to the Matrix, after which the plot will thicken. And I'm going to mention AI because hey, it's 2024. Then we'll move into the hustle, where things just get a little bit confusing. I'll look for some easy answers in the frame up. Then tensions will rise as we escalate and kind of go into our conclusion, and then denouement. So like any good mystery, I'm gonna leave things open for a sequel. So I'm gonna leave lots of loose ends, and we can tie them up some other time if we feel like it. All right, prelude. So our plot evolves from a single point. So I'm going to take us back to the days when we talked about perimeter security. I know some of us still talk about perimeter security, but there was a time, a brief romance, where we were able to actually sit inside and kind of create this perimeter that we used to protect each other. And then cloud happened. Third-party services happened. What we had as a perimeter kind of got extended. It got a little lumpy, where we had interconnections with other systems. And any company that has had technology, as much as they would like to have closed it behind a great perimeter, it's always been porous. They've always been interconnected, because that's a big part of what we get out of technology, the ability to interconnect. And then something else happened, and that was companies started to go digital, meaning they were going to have to let their customers in. So they used to be able to sort of hide all of their systems behind the firewall, but now actually you're inviting your customers in to connect to your systems. In fact, that's usually your business, the services that you're offering to your customers. So of course they have to be able to get in. And then what happened? Oh, then other folks tried to get in, and they were trying to get in for lots of different reasons and lots of different ways. And here's the thing. All of their bad behavior, almost all of it, denial of service attacks maybe not, but a lot of this bad behavior lives at layer 8, meaning the product, the system, the technology, it's all working as intended. It's just the behavior is bad. Their intent is bad, and they're abusing the product which is working as designed. So This left companies in an interesting place where you used to be able to kind of like put some rules on your firewall to maybe block bad behavior trying to sort of get into your systems, but now you're going to have to selectively determine which customers to say no to and how. And that is the background on our little story that we're getting into. So now I'm going to set some additional context. Looking at this lovely porous perimeter that we used to depend on, there was the firewall. So there was a sort of we would try and drive all ingress and egress traffic to a point that we controlled, a place where we could inspect it and we could make decisions about it. We could say yes or no. Those were usually decisions, yes or no. And that always reminded me of a particular visual, sort of thinking through it. I have a little theme song running in the back of my head. But the point is that it was when you sort of think of things as flows, or it is a point, a decision point, around which we can start to put technology, we can start to put strategy, and we can make decisions. Okay, now we're moving into the hook. We're moving really fast. I might have time for questions at the end, which will be great. Oh, okay, this might take a few seconds. All right, so I mentioned that about half of my career has been spent in fraud and anti-abuse, as well as the time I spent in cyber. So let's talk about your credit cards, debit cards, travel cards, what have you. The interesting thing about cards, to me, like if you want to take out your card and look at it, I find it fascinating how much of the security features or fraud prevention features for a long time were on the card. So you're sort of looking at this. This is a newer card, so you see there's a chip there. You see the card number, which in a lot of cases is embossed. Does anyone remember zip-zap machines, where you take your card in and run it through carbon? So they had to be embossed so that they would show up nicely on the carbon, and that's how the merchant proved that you were actually there. You've got the expiration date. You've got the first 4 digits of the card number also printed, so that if anyone was trying to do anything funky to the card, it shows up easily, and there's a hologram there. So, funny story, if you have a Visa card, it has a dove hologram. I believe it still has a dove hologram. Counterfeit holograms were a thing for a while. They looked like flying turkeys, some of them. They were pretty easy to eyeball. So when you look at a card, most of the fraud game, most of the fraud controls on the card, they look like they're on the front of the card. But it's actually the back of the card where the best parts of the game are. So you have the sort of, it will show you if it's been messed with signature panel. There's the CSC, not the CVV, the CSC, or the CVV2 printed on it. And then the mag stripe, the delicious mag stripe. So the mag stripe is where the actual CVV is, the original OG CVV. And there's also some information about the card and card holder, very limited. And there's a bunch of data in there that is basically the issuer, the person who created the card essentially and issued it to a customer. Some codes and information on the back that it's clues to the processor about how they want the card processed. So what I'm showing here, if you were to look up on Wikipedia, we're looking at track 1. I skipped track 2 because it's pretty repetitive of track 1, and track 3. So as you're sort of looking at this, it's like transport yourself back to 2000, those of you who were alive in 2000, and does this sort of visual on the right remind you of anything? Well, it reminded me of a packet, because in, let's say, like the late 90s is when I spent a lot of time working with TC dump and network headers, and I think that's around when Nmap was born, and it's when Snort was born, right? And so to me, when I sort of think about, okay, a lot of what fraud prevention was about earlier there was a lot that was based on the card and the data on the card, and if the combination of flags made sense, which is very similar to what we were doing with network intrusion detection at the time, which was we were looking at packets and trying to see if the things in the packets made sense. And then, of course, if there were too many of them, if they were all coming from the same place, things that kind of didn't make sense to us. And it is through our interpretation of the data that came through in the packet that we would apply a policy, decline something, refer something for review, what have you. And of course, we were able to create really cool tools and technology off of that, and map and snort being examples of that. So kind of going back to the point, or this is the part where I talk about, hold on. Okay. So what happened with cyber? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about fraud detection and how it has grown. But what happened with cyber? We went from the situation where we had a point, a decision point, where we were empowered and could make decisions about whether we were going to let traffic pass or not based on what's in the headers or what's in the packets. Well, what happened is we ended up having multiple applications and multiple, there's one packet does not tell you goodness or badness alone. You kind of had to roll them up. Like, what other clues did you have about behavior? And it started being, oh, okay, well, we were having lots of different maybe points where we needed to make a decision on a lot of different dimensions. And then suddenly we in cyber are talking about threat surfaces because, of course, our perimeters weren't a nice, neat little perimeter with one decision point. It's basically now our exterior-facing technology surfaces are, it's a surface of decision points because our perimeters are now software. And then, forgive me for this, but so we went from a point to a line to a surface. What's next? A solid, right? Because there's 7 layers. Application and network are like the top 2 layers, but there's other things under them. So a lot of modern defenders went from being able to be very rational and make a considered decision at a point to having a solid, basically, that they are an infinite number of decision points. And the thing that's not on here, because this is, of course, is sort of meant to look matrix-ish, as a sort of like a cube-type solid. But honestly, that suggests that there's like nice straight lines between some of these points. And it would have looked like a mess if I had zigzagged, but that's the truth, is that not only are there almost infinite points of decision, it becomes infinite when you consider all of the different paths between the points. Thank you for entertaining my need to get a little bit philosophical about it. We're going to switch back a little bit to, okay, well, that's kind of what happened to cyber, which is why, we have so many different technologies that collect telemetry, do we not? And what did that beget? So many technologies to hold the telemetry that was collected, did we not? And then we have all of these technologies to make sense out of the technology that we collected as fast as it can. And making sense as fast as it can, that calls for AI. Well, it played out a little bit differently over in fraud. So over in fraud, we had this point, this beautiful, delicious single point, and where we were going to make a decision. And folks started to get very mathy. I'll just say that. You're probably familiar with the terminology false positives and false negatives. Essentially, that's what happens when you are making a decision. Unless you are making a decision on something that is simply like it's an illogical combination of data, and so you can block it with no further thought. It is something that is prohibited. You can block it with no further thought. You are making a risk-based decision. And when you make a risk-based decision, that means you're dealing with uncertainty. And so you have false positives, where a good action is going to accidentally get blocked. And on the other side, you have false negatives, where a bad action is mistakenly authorized and gets through. Like, we are happy when the good actions are authorized, true positives, or actually, yeah, true positives, and then we are happy when the bad events get blocked, but largely we know that any decision that we make is going to be one of these 4 outcomes when we make a risk-based decision. And so what happened in fraud is they started getting really good at creating models. Models, by the way, that would run in real time while you were standing at a point of sale. So what I have here is a little bit of math. You know, it's after lunch. You guys, high energy, right? It's nice and cool in here. So what I have here is an example of what we call a gains chart. So this graph, we've got percentage of bad is true is the vertical axis, and then percentage of total is the horizontal axis. So if you just close your eyes and imagine you have like all of these transactions coming through, if you were to randomly guess which ones are bad, randomly, then you would, if you randomly guessed, then if you flagged 50% of the total, you would catch 50% of the bad is true, right? If you flagged 100% of the total, you would catch 100% of the bad is true, but we're getting really random. So that's the line. The line that's going straight up and to the right is guessing. And generally, we don't like to guess. We like to use some sort of set of heuristics or statistics or machine learning or something so that we can flag as few as possible, like let's say 5% of the total, in order to get as much of the bad as true as possible. Like we would like to get 90, 95, 100% with blocking as few as possible. And that curvy part is the lift above random. That's the gains. And so what we're looking for, the distance between our line and the model performance curve, if you will, is the gain. So right here we're looking at the gain versus random. And then now here's the part where I think a lot of cyber folks are gonna have real empathy for fraud folks, which is, so that horizon is as good as your model gets. And so your false positives and false negatives, you can choose where you sit on the curve. So right here we have our dot that's like the left lower point. We're declining as much or blocking as little as possible of the total volume. But you see we don't catch much of bad is true. If we want to catch more bad is true, then we need to block more of the total. We move up and to the right. But we can't get beyond the curve. That's the power of the model. That's as good as the model is. And we would never want to not live on that. We can't live not on that curve when we're using the curve. Okay, that was a poor way of explaining that, but that's okay, because what I wanted to say is when we get more information or improve our technology, then we can improve model performance. So this is where we seek investment. We seek investment because we want to lower our false positive rate while still catching as much of whatever bad is true. And this is kind of where fraud went. Where fraud went is they had their decision point, and what they did is they made tremendous amounts of investments in behavioral analytics, scoring technologies, intelligence on transactions, and on their customers. And now we sort of come back to where this went for fraud. The high stakes card chase. Do you like that? I really worked hard on I'm not very good at titling talks, so I really was like, I smiled when I came up with high stakes card chase, so I'm very proud of myself. Okay, so here we are, we're back to our point. By the way, all of this talk about points and lines is homage to a story called, it's a romance novel called The Dot and the Line. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. It's this teeny tiny little book about a dot, a line who falls in love with a dot. And he wins her away from a squiggle. But anyway, okay. So operating a risk system, this is how this plays out. You're a customer, you go to a point of sale. Let's say it's on the web because there's a form here versus you swipe your card. You enter your information, there's a magic moment, and then a response comes back. And you go along your merry way. Maybe it's a no, in which case going on your merry way might be calling customer service as to why you were declined, but regardless, there's an attempt, you try something, something happens, there's an outcome. And then on the back end, what's happening is there's a decisioning system that sort of has a lot of data that is able to take into consideration, and usually, I'm not going to necessarily say sophisticated, but I'm going to say elaborate set of rules, heuristics, models, scores, information, block lists, allow lists, velocity limits, all of these things that are sort of pulled together in that moment in milliseconds and then render back a decision. So we've sort of taken our point. Our point is now what the decision is, right? There's a lot that goes into making the decision, and then there's what the decision is. And I've sort of abstracted that, oh, that's the mic. I've abstracted that out to this diagram, which I've used over and over and over again. And this is why when a company goes digital, their life changes so much, because what we have is, we have this sort of platform layer where the decision strategy is implemented, but that decision is making decisions that affect the UX. It affects the product, it affects the customer experience, usually in flow, and there is a feedback loop. That system must have a learning loop in order to maintain performance. Because the thing I didn't say about model performance in the gain chart is, as soon as you release a model, it starts to degrade. And depending on how good your models are, how much data you have, you care a lot about how fast things degrade. It's one of the reasons why I always ask vendors who are selling me detection technology, how is this model trained? How can I tune it? And how can we update it? Because if I'm waiting on someone else, a third party, for signatures, I'm really unhappy because I know my model performance is degrading and I don't have any control. And I want to have more control back because they're my customers potentially being affected. Okay, so in a payment or billing fraud situation, we tend to put this decision point at move money in the fraud world, right? That makes sense. You're at checkout, you're at send money, you're about to click submit. That's where the decision happens. It turns out, fun fact, that this decision point where value shifts or exits a system or changes hands within a system, there's analogies in a bunch of different systems. So like move money, request money, okay. How about message, post, friend request, listing, attachment, wink, poke, all of these, like anything that you can kind of imagine, earn gold, trade shield, like where value moves is the first place we look. There's a lot of different versions of that. In some of them, there's content involved, like messages where we're looking to detect spam. But the point is the same. You have to have a point at which you're able to make some kind of decision. Here's what happened in fraud. What happened in fraud is account hijacking. And maybe some of you have worked on credential stuffing campaigns at clients or at your own organization, which sort of, okay, now we have 2 points. That's okay, right? Because we're kind of asking different questions at the different points. But then we realized, oh, well, actually, we also have, risk associated with new accounts. And sometimes they make profile changes. And actually, maybe they filed disputes. And all of these became points. So what's happening in fraud? What's happening in fraud is kind of what happened in cyber, in that we started with a point, and now we have a bunch of points in a row, not necessarily in the same order. And that's when, sad trombone, fraud and abuse prevention are now life cycle risk management versus a single flow, a single login to a transaction. It's created some dimensionality. So we have gone from a point to a bunch of points to maybe to a surface. And so that is, just like when that happened in cyber, that happening in fraud, I think folks are trying to figure out how to react to that. And in a lot of systems, what we see is, we see a lot more work being pushed to the analysts. people to make sense of these situations. And in other organizations, we have folks saying, well, maybe we could actually move some of this out to the edge. Remember the firewall? Remember the WAF? You know, there's lots of bot detection technologies or sort of session risk things that we could maybe put in place before the customer even hits the UX. So you have this sort of like, okay, some folks want to go to the edge, some folks want to push things more into operational work. Help us, cyber, you're our only hope. So this is where I'm going to confess to you that I'm about to talk to you about frameworks, but that I have been a non-believer in frameworks in the fraud space because I feel like, y'all, you saw the performance curve. You pick your loss rate. You know, if you can only stomach a decline rate, then you pick this other loss rate. And so I've always felt like, well, what's the point of frameworks? Because fraud teams can point to money lost. Like, they can set their targets there. How good is your program? How low is your loss rate, right? But actually, since we now have a proliferation of decision points and all of these life cycle questions, not to mention product questions, not to mention technology questions, well, maybe we could use a little bit of a framework. Maybe we could use a little bit of a frame up. So I looked to what cyber has. And the reason why I mention this, so my last gig at Reddit full-time was I was CISO and VP of Trust at Reddit. And it was easy for me to talk about fraud and abuse because it's easy to quantify, or easier, okay, to quantify than cyber. And so in cyber, a lot of how we can speak to decision makers and our boards and things like that about our performance is via our maturity or via our coverage of a framework, right? So we look to industry standards and we say, well, this is how we're doing compared to that. And that's how we are able to discuss frameworks. So I looked at a couple of these frameworks because maybe fraud could use that, a little infusion of that. And I put a call out, like people's favorite frameworks on the fraud space. Not a lot on that, but here's kind of what I was looking at. I did find something that looks kind of like attack, which is different attacks and exploits. I'm sure many of you have seen these vendor maps, and there are some of those for fraud. And then conceptual models from regulators, that's interesting. Actually, they have more of that on the fraud side, probably because they're part of financial services and payments, and there's a lot of regulatory engagement there. And then maturity framework. So let me quick show you what I found. And you're not meant to read those. I just wanted to show side by side kind of cyber and fraud. So we've got MITRE ATT&CK. Many of you probably familiar with that. On the fraud side, there's been efforts to kind of lay out all of the different attacks and exploits. Here is, so the one on the right is the fraud one. It's an ecosystem map of vendors. I've seen a lot of cybersecurity ones laid out like that, but I had never seen this one laid out on a maple leaf before. So I just wanted to give that to you as a gift, that these ecosystem maps can also come in the shape of a maple leaf. Thank you, Canada. And then this got kind of interesting, actually, because the Federal Reserve recently released a fraud classifier model, and that's really a decision tree taxonomy. And so while you can't read this, and I apologize for that, what this is showing us, like, the difference between, okay, you're looking at something as fraud. First, is it authorized or unauthorized? And then it has a definition of that. And if it's authorized, is it this use case, or this use case? And that reminded me kind of what we were trying to do with Styx and Taxi, and are still trying to do. Because if we don't have firm taxonomies, then sharing threat intel data at scale in a really useful way gets hard. So Styx is fairly elaborated at this point, and what's happening, what the Federal Reserve released is a little bit more high level, but this is interesting, that the fraud industry, which, by the way, like if you're in credit card fraud, information sharing is kind of what the networks have been doing and what a lot of the vendors have been doing for a long time. It was harder for us to figure out how to share that kind of information in a privacy-preserving way in cyber because we didn't have that sort of central group doing that. This is just kind of interesting because this is a place where I really do think cyber's kind of leading the way, but it's interesting because fraud has always had more leeway around information sharing. And then I bring us to our favorite framework, which is the NIST CSF. I'm sorry, that's my favorite framework. And so I present it alone because it's really more of a process and like program overview kind of a framework. And a lot of organizations then map that into a maturity model. And some of you, if you've done a NIST self-assessment or gotten a third-party assessment, you get scored 1 through 5 on these different things, which is basically showing your maturity against a framework. And the reason why there's no fraud version on here is because I think a lot of the folks who are providing guidance to fraud teams did look to something like NIST CSF because they're paywalled and very tightly copyrighted, so I wasn't able to grab any of those to provide in a public presentation, but they're roughly trying to like map the fraud life cycle to the NIST life cycle for cybersecurity, which is kind of interesting. And now we're going to raise the tension a little bit. So everybody kind of do this because you've been sitting now. You had lunch and you were sitting. All right, whew. We're going to get a little bit more philosophical about working at layer 8. So I showed you this sort of risk decisioning system diagram before, and what I'm going to do is talk to you about, okay, so if you're starting from 0, here's the thing with maturity frameworks. They don't necessarily tell you where to start. And so the reason why I sort of feel like I didn't quite find what I was looking for as far as frameworks is I think folks want things that are tangible. They want to understand where to start. Where do you start? And no one has one of these risk decisioning systems straight out of the box. So where they start is they find context. They sort of figure out what's going on, what is the problem that I'm seeing. And for a lot of entities, that's actually their credit card chargeback rate. But you're going to find it in, the problem will probably rear its head in operations, and that's where you're going to need to start looking for clues. Then you figure out where you're going to act. So you might not have you might not have a decisioning system yet, but you're going to have, where's your point? Where you're going to place your decision point? And that's where you're going to start implementing policies and simple heuristics and things like that. But you're going to figure out where you can act, and you're going to start ad hoc and cobbling things together. For a lot of entities, if you're dealing with credit card fraud, that is going to be at your processor. Maybe you might not have a native payment rule system, but your processor probably does. And then what you are going to do is you're going to reframe the problem because it's really not just about the point. You need clues from all of these other places through the life cycle. And this is where we start having to talk to our friends in product. And so that is, to me, this is where things get really interesting because it takes us out of cyber. Like a lot of what we're talking about figuring out what the problem is, where the bad actors are, and then where we're going to implement our decision strategy, that's still cyber to a certain respect. But when we start acting and changing the UX and value prop potentially of a product, that's a place where cyber isn't always invited, but it's really fun. So I encourage you because it's really helpful when you can help folks solve these problems, their business problems and customer problems. And then you move into, this is like the Enter Sandman, Enter AI theme song here, which is you train your system. And your system is not just your models and rules. Your system is the whole learning loop. So all of the data that gets generated and plowed into your model training, you're constantly improving your models. Models are forever. You can never leave them alone. There's no such thing as set and forget. You have to keep training, tuning, collecting more telemetry. And so this is my experiment, y'all. the Carto fraud framework from Allison of Cartomancy Labs. How did that happen? I don't know. Did I force some of the words here? I might have. Context, act, reframe, train, optimize. So this is my attempt. I'll open this up. I want feedback on this. It doesn't have to be called Carto. I'm not that cutesy. But I do want to be able to offer folks a place to start for some of these problems. And the reason why I mentioned some of this to you is because we're seeing a lot of convergence happen between fraud, abuse, and cyber. I mentioned when I was at Reddit, I was their CISO and VP of trust. So I was leading cyber, I was also leading trust and safety. I've had a lot of roles where I've had 1 foot in cyber and 1 foot in fraud, or 1 foot in cyber and 1 foot in product. And it's a place where we're expanding and where we can play a leadership role. And here's a little extension of the Carto framework, which is, of course, it in itself is probably a process, kind of like NIST CSF, because it will repeat. But there is also people, process, technology, and metrics. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful drive from Charlotte it was. I started thinking, I almost drove off of the road because I realized I could offer metrics that go along with maturity. Anyway, the first place, so in context, you're gonna be mining operations a lot. So leadership and talent in operations is where we're going to probably start growing there. As we move into ACT, it becomes more of a data game. We move into needing talent in analyst teams. And then as we reframe product, as we train and up-level the back-end systems, that's development. And then as we move into optimization, data science. And then the unit of interest. So in cyber, in network intrusion detection, for a long time it was the packet. I think a lot of us are actually working higher in the application level there now. But for a fraud team, the first focus would be chargebacks, then transactions, then identities, and then customers. Yep, there's actually a difference there. Identity is like who showed up to your site that day. Customer speaks to sort of a larger understanding of that customer. And then optimize, we're hitting life cycle. Tech, case management to start, and then we get into more sophisticated rules deployment via rules engines, identity technology like bot detection, device ID, device reputation, and then we're putting a lot of investment in AI ML. And in optimize, we orchestrate the whole thing with integrated decisioning. A little bit about this sort of fraud prevention techniques or tools that we're going to most use. And then last, I just needed to brag about it because I came up with metrics every day trying to find metrics for things. So chargeback rate to loss rate is actually a jump for a lot of organizations. And then you move from how much are you losing to how much are you letting through. And first we start talking about decline rates, but then we start talking about the flip side of that, which is how much good volume are we able to allow to go through while holding declines and losses steady. And then in optimization, we move into a higher value station where we're actually talking about things like customer lifetime value and profitability. And those are really fun conversations to play a leadership role in. Okay. Okay, so then here's where I make a brief segue and reinforce that I think one of the most interesting things about what I've learned in my time in fraud and anti-abuse is what it takes to build a winning program and be involved in product. And as I have managed blended teams, the evolution from application security to product security, and then really infusing that with the context of the user experience and some of the risks associated with abuse, that's a new vision of product security. That's a fantastic opportunity for collaboration and folks with different skill sets to add value. And it's just one of my favorite parts about trying to win this game, is that it is a surface that we are not necessarily well versed in the beginning, but it's where we can have a tremendous amount of impact for our businesses as well as for our overall risk. And so that may mean speaking with product managers or speaking with folks who are responsible for customer experience or the user experience in general. So this slide is just a couple points that I like to talk to product managers about, because you may have the greatest security architects in the world who are the best at threat modeling, but I tell you, when you are able to incentivize a product manager to design a user experience to be resistant in the face of adversaries, they know those flows inside out. They are creative for a living too, and they can be a wonderful resource if you can sort of clarify for them that all systems will be gamed. Fantastic paper, by the way. Brian Arthur, Santa Fe Institute, all systems will be gamed. Love that paper. And it's true. And here's the thing, and the discussion point with product is that all systems tend to be gamed on their value proposition, right? Communication platforms, spam. Influence campaigns, harassment, payment systems, payment fraud, payment fraud, money movement, stealing stuff. And any system that you named, it's kind of like the feature that folks most like, or sort of consider game systems, right? And how game cheating works. It's often manipulating mechanics of the game as designed that give players great value and enjoyment from the games. Those are the features on which abuse tends to happen, because it's WAI. Working as intended. It's just the behavior is bad, the intent is bad. And then product managers also, a lot of them have this concept of personas, where they're sort of, okay, you know, this is being designed for a young person, or this is being designed for someone who speaks this language. Well, you can also have good user and bad user personas. And you want to have appropriate experiences for all of them. So the worst thing is when you have that magic decision point and you're so good at making decisions, but you don't have any options in the UX. So a story I remember is that an organization that I worked with, a fraudster was correctly identified as being a fraudster, and the system returned a user experience that said something like, in big red letters, of course, error, fraud alert, try again later, which is not actually the experience you want to offer to your attempted fraud users. So product managers need to design for the happy path, but then you, as someone who is going to help reframe how they think about some of this, you want to have that optionality so that when you do detect, we are detectives all, when you do detect, you send them along the right journey. And then a few other concepts here, but I will make these slides available after the event, and I'm happy to take more questions on them, but since I have 5 minutes left, I have not been watching. Since I have 5 minutes left, I'll wrap up, which is, okay, now we sort of got to a point where we have gotten a glimpse of how fraud has tackled detection, and they've sort of elevated it to decision science and a product security and product risk type program. But don't worry, nothing's solved. There's plenty of work to be happening, and the high-speed card chase continues off into the sunset. So we're about to head into the sunset, and I just wanted to remind folks that fraud, just payment fraud alone, this is really just about credit card fraud, this slide. These are big numbers. This is a lot of money, a lot of value lost for hardworking businesses. And so things that we can do to prevent that or detect that before money moves, huge. It's all about speed. And the game is just getting a little bit more complicated because the fraudsters are gassed up. So I'll just mention a couple of these, which is, I mean, you can't open up a news article without someone mentioning deep fakes, right? It's like it's either AI or deep fakes. It feels like every article that I'm reading. but it's real, and how this is affected. Deepfake itself isn't fraudulent necessarily. It's how it's used. So whether it's used to juice up a phishing scam, or whether it is used to get someone into someone's account via a customer service call-in, this is something that systems are going to have to react to. This is a place where I think cyber can play a role in helping. I did also want to mention a bit about scams, because if any of you are involved, even tangentially, in solving credential stuffing and account hijacking, scams are really interesting for banks and retailers specifically. In a lot of what we see in fraud, I've stolen, or not I, but like, you know, the fraudster. The fraudster steals someone's financial credentials, right? Like steals someone's card, that's the classic. Or steals their card information via compromise and uses it fraudulently. Okay, that's like big use case one of online digital fraud. Second is account hijacking. How did I hijack your account? Did I hack the product? No, probably not. What's easier? Tricking you out of your login credentials. Okay, so we've seen a lot of that, and that's what's driving a lot of credential stuffing campaigns, lost credentials that are then going to be used in account hijacking. Scams is different. Scams is digital systems have gotten good enough at identifying and resisting account hijacking that now what fraudsters are doing is, I'm going to trick you directly into sending me money. And so you'll be reading a lot more about scams in the news. The reason why this is interesting is because stealing your credit card and hijacking your account have historically been considered unauthorized, and therefore, at least in the US, you're covered under Reg E and Reg Z, and the credit card companies and the banks have all agreed, okay, we'll make the customer good for that. Scams is different, because if you yourself are involved in sending the funds to the unauthorized party, and a lot of this is expedited by P2P payments, which, you know, as someone who is like a merchant sometimes and sells things sometimes, I love P2P payments, but it creates a problem when the person on the other end is a scammer. So scams are going to come up in the news a little bit in the future, and they are driving a new wave of fraud, because a lot of what we depend on in fraud detection systems is that the person in front of us is or is not who we think they are. And now if we have situations where they are who we think they are, they just happen to have been tricked, how are we going to detect that? Big open question. And then the last driver is Finovation, right? FinTech and all of the things that are happening, cryptocurrency, faster payments. They're making things move faster. It makes it hard. It makes it harder and harder for us to be able to manage in a single decision point when there's like an explosion of different financial instruments that things can shift around in. So I just wanted to provide a little ... for where fraud is going. And on that note, I will simply say thank you, BSides Knoxville.
Let's have one question for our speaker.
Hi there. How much of this is a just a straight vendor play? Like chargebacks is the same for any company. Credential stuffing is the same for any company. So it's well suited to just picking a vendor to solve it. But then some of the other stuff you mentioned, like, you know, likes and like the sort of fraud around like what is unique to your business doesn't work well with a vendor. So how do we reconcile those two?
Yeah, so the question was how much of this is a pure vendor play. And I think a lot of it, so I tend to have worked for organizations that wanted to build their own or needed to solve those problems before there was effective vendor solutions available. I do think some of the technology on the edge, some of the authentication technologies, those can be outsourced. So a lot of it could be a vendor play. But it really depends on how much the organization, like it depends on how much the organization wants to own their own destiny. So I think that it is fairly rare for something like account risk, and it happens someplace, like rules engines might get outsourced, but the rules development, the model development, a lot of that would stay in-house because it's your customers and your products. So it varies. And I think I mentioned that I see a little bit of convergence in the cyber and fraud technology universe. And part of that is because there are some existing fraud detection service providers that you might kind of like call their APIs right around the time of transaction to augment your own decisioning systems or even outsource that. Those folks are sort of like bridging back towards authentication. You have authentication vendors who are sort of trying to take advantage of their experience with device ID and IP reputation to sort of smush in. What's new for a lot of these folks is being activated in a product context. So it's a little bit different when you're calling on those services to protect your corporate environment, when you are calling on them within the context of your own user experiences and product. Different organizations have a different willingness to outsource that. But great question. A lot of the technology is stock because a lot of it is based on analytics technology and machine learning AI technology, which of course is getting built into everything these days.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison.
Thank you. Oh, if you do end up wanting a copy of the slides, I will try and put them on Sketch and also at cartomancylabs.com, where my newsletter exists.